Mr. Speaker.
Talofa lava.
Talofa lava, Mr. Speaker. Malo lelei, kia orana. Mr. Speaker, the tone of this debate has been quite good so far, and I think what Shane Ardern said earlier about the fact that mistakes are made, mistakes from ministers are made, and I think within what was achieved, though, I mean, we do need to remember that what Annette King did as the Minister of Police during her time in terms of that complete overhaul of the policing bill was a huge achievement, and unfortunately this is one mistake that has been pointed out, but the usage of urgency to correct that is the right usage of urgency, and so here we are now discussing this legislation. The tone until the beginning of Melissa Lee's speech was good, but I have to point out that her comments about my friend and colleague Chris Hipkins being scruffy and dirty are just unfair, and he's not scruffy and dirty at all. And we do wonder what happened to the Melissa Lee build motorways to get rid of all crime and stop South Aucklanders going to the rest of Auckland to commit crime. What happened to that big plan and strategy? We're wondering where that's gone. But that's besides the point. Back onto the policing bill. There was a mistake made, and it's good that we've seen urgency being used for the right purpose here today so that that can be corrected. What we have in front of us is the Policing Storage of Youth Identifying Particulars Amendment Bill. This bill amends the Policing Act 2008 to restore the legal position under the Police Act 1958 in relation to the storage of youth identifying particulars, fingerprints and photographs. And as Annette, as Shane Ardern and as other members that have spoken on this particular piece of legislation have said, it was an inadvertent mistake that is now being corrected. Under the 2008 Act, the police can only store youth identifying particulars following a conviction. This means that if the IP of the youth is obtained and the outcome of the case is that an order under section 2830 is not made so that the youth is brought before district court for sentence or decision, then the IP cannot be stored. This legal position was not intended to be altered by the 2008 Act. There was no intention to alter that at all, and as my colleague Chris Hipkins has said, basically what this bill is doing is returning us to the status quo. There was no intention to change it. There needs to be greater scrutiny of complex legislation to minimise loopholes, and the need for the use of urgency to ensure that valuable parliamentary time is managed effectively. So there does need to be a greater level of scrutiny of complex legislation, and we do need to keep in mind that that was a very complex piece of legislation. So in some ways I think the House understands that we do need to be a little bit forgiving because of the complex nature of the legislation that we're talking about, and the fact that a mistake has been made, but it so easily could have been made. However, going into the future, a higher level of scrutiny needs to occur to try and avoid that from happening. When the Policing Act 2008 came into force, a number of changes were made, including the way constables' oaths were administered. However, even after the changes, oaths were still being administered as the same way under the 1958 Act. This required an amendment of the Act to validate the oaths that continued until October 2009. So since this very complex piece of legislation was brought in 2008, I think this will only be the second correction that's been made, and hopefully this is the only other anomaly that we find in the policing bill. In October of last year, Parliament had to rectify legislation where an amendment to the Summary Proceedings Act that came into force in June 2008 excluded some minor property offences in the Crimes Act from being in Schedule 1 of the Summary Proceedings Act. From Hansard with regards to legislative mistakes, Charles Cheval said we need to look at why it happened and how we can do our best, I think, through the safeguards we have in the form of the officials in a select committee procedure and through our decisions as parties to vote in particular ways on particular legislation to safeguard against this sort of mistake being repeated too often. the reality is that we aren't perfect here, and mistakes are going to occur, and the point that Charles was trying to make, and I think we'd all agree on, that the fewer mistakes that can be made, the better. So whatever levels of scrutiny we need to put into place to ensure that they don't occur, the better. According to the explanatory note, 1,200 youths have an outcome under Section 283 of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act 1989, and the related IP cannot be stored due to the unintended mistake in the 2008 Act. The storage of the youth IP is vital for the detection of youth offenders who go on to re-offend, and it is important that we have the correct mechanisms to prevent young offenders from progressing to become adult criminals. And that is the point of taking this through urgency at the moment, really, because what we don't want is for young people who have been convicted to get off from charges because of the fact that their information was stored in a way that could be deemed illegal because of the anomaly that exists within the legislation currently, and that is what this legislation is seeking to rectify. This necessary rectification will be vital to solving crimes, hence why we on this side of the House are supporting the piece of legislation we have in front of us that's being put forward under urgency, the Policing Storage of Youth Identifying Particulars Amendment Bill. We were slightly surprised that this was so secretive in terms of urgency and in terms of us not being aware until how long before we found out that this was going up? Oh, okay. So it was at the last minute that we got this and put before us, but that's okay. That's, you know, we support this legislation. So basically, this bill does amend the Policing Act 2008 to restore the legal position under the Police Act 1958 in relation to the storage of youth identifying particulars. And we do need to make sure that if our young people are convicted, that they don't get off on some sort of technicality, and that's what this bill is seeking to ensure doesn't happen. I just want to go back and also again thank Annette King in her role as Minister of Police with the great work that they did with this legislation. We know that there are other pieces of legislation in this country that could do with an overhaul as well, that have been added to time and time again, and the Young Persons and the Family Act and other pieces of legislation where they've constantly been added to, but no one's actually, so it's not very, so in terms of the overall piece of legislation, it's not very coherent, basically, and that was what Annette, as Minister of Police, sought to fix and address when they dealt with this. And so what we need to do is look at other pieces of legislation that may need to have similar treatment given to them, knowing full well that even though that's done, there is still the possibility that mistakes are made, as this bill that we've got before us today points out. We have been concerned about the overuse of urgency with regards to some of the things that the government's been trying to push through, but in this particular case, we think that this is a good use of urgency. One of my local principals actually, and before I finish up, pointed out that he found it really interesting that the government would use urgency for national standards, which had no evidence to support them, which were contested hotly by those in the education sector, and yet the government would say things like child abuse in this country it requires urgent attention, and yet not push through any legislation here in urgency to actually address that issue. And before I end, one of the pieces of legislation that I constantly bring up that needs to be addressed urgently but hasn't been, and should be one of the ones that we're seeing go through in urgency, is actually that Domestic Violence Act that continues to languish at the bottom of the order paper. So the next time, and I'm sure there will be a next time, the national government decide to bring us through urgency, then I do plead with them to actually consider bringing that domestic violence bill through the urgency process. It was consulted on widely across the sector.
it
continues to be pushed down the order paper. It was 58.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Her time has expired. Can I just for future reference, the member must use the title or the full name when referring to members of the House. For future reference. Dr. Cam Calder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.